Marks. Good evening, everyone. If you could all mute yourselves starting now, and then we'll have some time for Q&A where you can unmute yourself or write in the chat. I'm going to keep the chat open. If anything comes up as Maharat Ruth talks, feel free to jot it down. And if she wants to answer in real time, that's great, or wait till the end. At least it'll be there. It'll be there waiting. So anyway, Chanukah Sameach to everybody. I hope you're having a good week, all things considered. It's always great to see your faces. I miss every one of you. So it's really nice for me to see everybody. This is our last CBS Women Insights meeting for the year. And right now I'm going to work with Carol Goldberg and Karen Harris about kind of what it'll look like starting 2021. And we'll make sure we publicize that. We'll talk a little bit more about it at the end of the program. Tonight, we have a real treat. We welcome Maharat Ruth Friedman from Washington, D.C. Let me tell you a little bit about Maharat Ruth and her many accomplishments. She grew up in the Chicago area in a modern Orthodox family, the daughter of a Hillel rabbi. She graduated from Barnard in 2007. Then she learned at Drisha, which is an intensive Jewish text study program for women in New York. And then she applied to become part of the first cohort of ordained women from Yeshivat Maharat, which is founded by Rabbi Avi Weiss and Rabbi Sarah Hurwitz. Once she finished there, she began working at Ohev Shalom, the National Synagogue in DC, which was when she graduated in 2013, and she's been there ever since. According to her bio, her responsibilities include, among many other things, I'm sure, overseeing conversions, leading adult education programs, counseling couples on issues of infertility. She's a founding member of the Beltway Vad, which shapes religious guidelines for the Orthodox community in the DC area. I would be very interested to hear a little bit more about what the Beltway Vad is. I did a little clicking around, but I'd love to hear from you about that. She is married to Yoni, and she is the mother of 2 boys and a Shih Tzu dog. Is that correct? Got it. I happen to have a very special personal connection with Maharat Ruth. When I was at Northwestern University a million years ago, her dad, Rabbi Michael Blinsky, was my Hillel rabbi. And I used to babysit 4-year-old Ruthie and her sister Miriam, her 2-year-old sister Miriam. So that was a real treat for me. And over the years, before my in-laws made Aliyah to Jerusalem, and they lived in Skokie, where my sister-in-law still lives. Every time I'd go to Skokie, I would either give Ruth's dad a call, or if we could even get together. The last time I was there, we got to sit at Starbucks for a little while and catch up. And so we've kept in touch, which has been really special for me. I'm thrilled to reconnect with Ruth as an adult. That was a very funny email. I was like, I don't know if you remember me, but and it was fun. It was really nice to reconnect, which is great. So I want to thank you for being here. I'm going to ask Maharat Ruth to tell us about her journey to become a spiritual leader in the Orthodox community. And then we can have some Q&A. I have a couple prepared questions, but if there's anything that y'all want to know, please type it in the chat, or when there's a little space, you can unmute yourself and ask the question as well. And then after that, we'll have a little bit time at the end, and Ruth is going to do a little Hanukkah teaching with us. We'll do some text learning together, and then we'll say goodnight. Okay, so I think we are ready to go. Maharat Ruth, take it away.
Thank you. Oh, I'm spotlighted. Thank you. It is truly a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Both with people I have known for just about my whole life. I don't remember the details of your babysitting, but I do remember that I had a babysitter, Vicky. So yeah, that's not a comment on you. It's a comment on being for. Yes, and also I did not intentionally position myself behind or in front of the oil painting portrait of my Shih Tzu dog, but that is what is in the background. So I know that some of us have new puppies in our families, and you're in good company. We clearly cherish her more than our human children. And that is Coco, and hopefully she will leave me alone and not bark. So I have to say, it's also really tremendous pleasure to be here, as I've never even been in your state before, which is crazy now that I sit here and think about that. Of course, I know Rabbi Gelman through various things. And I guess your rabbi also, for different points in my life. And so, like I said, it's really a pleasure to be here with you tonight. And so, yeah, like I'll just share some about my journey, about Maharat. Please just unmute yourself at any point to ask questions, very casual, or you can enter them in the chat if you prefer. It's really totally not a big deal, whatever you would like. I'll open the chat now so I can just see everything as it comes in. So yeah, the story of how I got to Maharat, when people hear, oh, well, there's this new program to train Orthodox women to be, rabbis in the Orthodox community, that what possibly could have led you to want to do that? And it's both an interesting story and a very boring story. And by that, I mean that my dad, as Vicky said, is a rabbi. And so I grew up in a rabbinic household. And when your father's a Hillel director, just like so many aspects of the rabbinate, it's not just, oh, that's my dad's job, that's my dad's life. Shabbases are spent at Hillel, sick days are spent on the couch at Hillel, watching on the TV with the students coming in and out. And so, especially, so immersed in this rabbinic life. And yet, even though I grew up in a pluralist setting, in that it was a Hillel, not like an Orthodox synagogue. And I went to, I joke, I sort of went through all the stages. I went to a Reform preschool, a conservative day school, and an Orthodox high school. And so even though I grew up in that kind of that more open, more fluid environment, from my perspective, ultimately I knew that we were Orthodox, and Orthodox women didn't become rabbis. They didn't do things like that. There was just no model for that. And so it never occurred to me that was an option. And I was always jealous of the kids who, adults love to ask kids, do you know what you want to be when you grow up? And I would always jealous of the kids, or envious of the kids who had an answer for that. And I never had an answer. And so I went to Barnard because it was in Manhattan, and the other schools I applied to were not. And I went to visit when I was like 17 or 18 and just fell in love with the city and knew I wanted to be there. And so that was a good way to do it. And come time to graduate college 4 years later, there's nothing I want to do. I studied psychology and Jewish studies, which I joke is like what I ended up doing essentially, but nothing really spoke to me. And at that point, my good friend was planning to start studying at Drisha, and told me about the program. And they had a modest stipend that when you're 22 was enough to sort of live off of if you have parents who can, still pay your cell phone bill and health insurance and things like that. And so I spent 2 years studying Torah and getting acquainted with this new world of, I would say, like open Orthodox Jewish leadership. I feel because I went to an Orthodox high school, and a classically Orthodox high school, the Orthodoxy that I knew was one that was more, let's say, rigid, closed-minded, not really open into the outside world so much. It was a modern Orthodox high school, but still, modern Orthodox high schools, at least outside of New York, rarely have modern Orthodox teachers. Or maybe it's better now, but certainly back then, there were very few modern Orthodox teachers. My teachers were, black hat. Those are the people willing to become day school teachers. And so it definitely was an environment that cultivated not extremism, but certainly I think more closed-mindedness than open-mindedness. And I always fought my rabbis on that. I don't think they knew what to do with me because I was a good student, but I just wasn't into it, and they couldn't figure out what box to put me in. And so I just, I just kind of wandered, and then feel like I found my religious niche in this more open Orthodox world that was brewing in New York and had been started by Rabbi Avi Weiss. And so by the end of my second year at Drisha, Rabasar Hurwitz, if anyone here, I don't know if anyone here knows her, had just been conferred. They called it a conferral ceremony. They didn't even know what to call it. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with it, but she had been interning at the Hebrew Institute of Riverdale, which is Rabbi Avi Weiss's shul, for a couple of years in New York. And they wanted to employ her. And they were like, well, you've already interns, you're not an intern. And so we don't know what to call you. And so they had this, what they called conferral ceremony, where she was given the title of Maharat, and really essentially recognized as a member of the clergy in the synagogue. And that was in March of 2009. And it was this very magical moment. It was played up, and a lot of people came, press attention came, and it was just, it felt, there was, when something new was happening and you feel that energy and that excitement, and you could tell that like something, this meant something. And shortly thereafter, they announced that they were creating Maharat. And my gut said, yeah, Ruth, this is what you're doing. And naturally, some people sort of said to me, are you sure you want to be in the first graduating class? Like, that's not a good idea. You don't want to, you don't need to be the guinea pig for this one. But I don't know if you've ever had that moment where in your gut, and I see the question, I'll answer in a moment, where if you've had that in your gut where something just feels right, even if it seems like a bad decision, but still feels like the right thing to do. And I just said, you know what, like, this is the right thing to do. And I know that. And I followed my gut and I started. And so I'll pause here just because I see there's a question to translate the meaning of Maharat. So because I have the wonder of chat, Maharat, so it's interesting politically. So when they were preparing for Rabbi Sarah's conferral ceremony in March 2009, and I don't know who they is because it's like still hush hush who exactly they refers to, but they were trying to figure out what is this and what are we going to call her? And I think that they knew correctly that if she's now Rabbi Sarah, and I'll talk about that in a moment, if her title was something like Rabbah or Rabbi, that would shut down the conversation. And most of the Orthodox world would completely freak out, for lack of a better word, and just, go crazy, because that's just exactly like a rabbi. And we don't have Orthodox rabbis, and that it would shoot it down before it even began the conversation. And so they got together and tried to figure out, okay, we need an alternative title. And what they came up with was Maharat, which is an acronym that stands for Manhiga Hilchatit Ruchanit Toranit, a leader in halacha, Jewish law, spirituality, and Torah, which, as I joke, is a very verbose way of saying rabbi. But that's what it landed on. And then the yeshiva was opened under the name of Yeshivat Maharat. And it was interesting because it didn't make such a splash. People definitely noticed it, but it was sort of like, okay, Avi Weiss is up to something, and these liberal Orthodox people are up to something, but her title's not rabbi, like, it's fine, whatever. And the title didn't stick. I guess they felt that certainly at their own synagogue, it wasn't registering, and a couple people were being exceedingly disrespectful and pronouncing it not Maharat, but Maharat. And so then I think it was less than a year later, they said, you know what, we're going to change it to Rabbah. I'll put it in the chat, Rabba. And that's when the rest of the Orthodox world noticed, because that has an R and the B in the root of it and connotes rabbi. And that's when people really noticed that and got very, very upset. I think they had felt that the program hadn't really been fully honest about its intentions, and that it really was seeking to ordain Orthodox women as rabbis, but that by calling it Maharat, maybe the program was being a little disingenuous, because pretending like that wasn't the ultimate intention, when in fact it was. I think that these things are really complicated, and the politics are complicated. And I've learned a lot from this experience about what it means to try to create social change in any setting. And we romanticize the revolutionaries, and which is, it's good, they have their place, but the reality, a lot of social change happens through stages. And so I appreciate and understand and respect where Maharat came from, I understand why people had the reaction that they did. So hurt, but it became this sort of very confusing thing because her title stayed Rabbah. No one had graduated Maharat yet. This is before 2013 when I graduated, the first graduating class. And so no one had a title yet except for her, which was Rabbah, and the yeshiva was still called Yeshivat Maharat. So, I mean, I could continue talking about that, but that's, we can talk for another minute about the title and then go back to the yeshiva itself. And so just so what happened with the title, and I want to clarify this because it can be very confusing. So when I graduated with two other women, Rachel Feingold, who is in Montreal, and Abby Shire, who's actually also in Montreal. And it's coincidental and it's terribly incestuous, but also purely coincidence that Abby is married to the rabbi who is the senior rabbi of the synagogue that Rachel works at. But that's really coincidence. And so we all graduate with the title Maharat, and okay, fine. But within 2 years, the next graduating class, they also graduated. There were two women, also Maharats. And then we had 5 Maharats. And by the third graduating class, a number of the women were like, no, this title is not working. And they took the title either Rabbanit or Rabbah. So since then, we've had Rabbanites, we've had Rabbahs, and we've also had rabbis. It's kind of this goofy situation where what title a woman takes really depends on the context that she's entering in, which is like not a system I necessarily think has been my favorite system, but that's where it's landed. And I think it reflects the messiness of the situation in general, which is something that's certainly beyond our control. And I think it's really interesting that after the acrobatics to get to find the title Maharat, and to introduce it and to discover that it didn't really land. It didn't take off so much. I think that it was harder to trademark, but also that quickly it lost its appeal, and women graduating the programs were saying correctly, but I'm not a rabbi. I am a rabbi, and my title should reflect that. And so it's actually reached the point where of the women who've graduated also with the title Maharat, two of them have actually switched over to Rabbah. And so now there are only 3 women who actually go by the title of Maharat, even though there are more than 40 graduates of the program. So I am one of them, and that's really just because I've worked at the same shul for 7.5 years. And so to change it would be to change it for internal purposes. And it hasn't reached a point where it's felt necessary. However, I think one interesting thing that has happened is that instead of my being introduced now, so I work at a shul with a male rabbi, there's 2 clergy. So it's me and a male rabbi named Rabbi Shmuel Hertzfeld. And whenever we go anywhere that is not our shul, and I'm introducing myself or he's introducing me, he says, this is my colleague, Rabbi Ruth Friedman. Because what we discovered is he would say, hi, I'm Rabbi Shmuel Hertzfeld, and he's a man, he's wearing the kippah, and he's just visible. More people know who this guy is, right? Especially if you're in, let's say, an interfaith setting. And then he says, and this is my colleague, Maharat Ruth Friedman, and I'm wearing, a headband, but like that could go either way. And it's just not clear who I am. And they hear Maharat, and it's just like, what, and people don't know what to do with me. And so we use the title rabbi now in any setting that's really just not our specific shul or a community that would know who I am. And yeah, if I'm speaking about myself and what I do, I say I'm a rabbi, like I serve as a rabbi at da 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 da. And I think that these changes are also really reflective of the incredibly rapid pace at which women's issues, gender issues have progressed in America in the past 10, 11, 12 years, where, in 2009 and 2010, when the program was beginning, we felt like we had to get up on a pedestal and say, don't worry, we're not rabbis. We have the same training, and we're going to be clergy, but it's not rabbi. It's not the same thing. It's not the same thing. Don't worry. And then within a couple of years, we're like, yes, it is. Like, wait a minute, what? Yes, it is. And what are we doing to feminism by pretending that we're not? Yeah. And it's been very interesting to feel, like in some ways an observer to all the cultural shifts that are happening in the United States, but also part of it. And I really understand and see where it's coming from. And so I wonder if, sometimes if the title Maharat is a betrayal to women, I should switch to rabbi publicly. And just like I said, it's not, I'm not making a statement by not, it's just that it's just not something that's come up yet. Like, it's not something we felt that we had to happen. So yeah, so it's certainly been interesting. And I can pause here for a minute and I'd love to hear questions. Yes.
I just wanted to say I came across an article that was in Washington Jewish Week from about 3 years ago. It was all about the Orthodox Union and titles of women, et cetera, et cetera. And it said at the time there were 4 women, female clergy in OU synagogues. And at the end of the article, you made the comment, I'm sad for Orthodoxy that there's so much attention devoted to what women can't do. Maybe we can think of a more constructive identity for our movement than women don't do stuff in Orthodoxy. It's destructive in many ways. And I think that sounds totally in line with like what you're saying about, I don't know that I'd go so far that Maharat is a betrayal, but this idea that like, kind of downplaying or saying that, women don't, it was very, very interesting to me, and it resonated,
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. So, it's like it's been a big struggle because, as you said, in the past few years, the RCA, which is the Rabbinic Council of America, which represents Orthodox rabbis, sort of not, there's the Aguda, which represents the more like ultra-Orthodox rabbis in America. The RCA represents the more modern Orthodox and perhaps even some centrist Orthodox as well. And they've tried to come after us, and the Orthodox Union has tried to come after us. And what they land on at the end of the day, we've actually literally had meetings with them where we've broken down, okay, here are my responsibilities. Like, what do you have an issue with? And they can't land on any particular thing that bothers them. But it's something about the sum total of my responsibilities plus having a title that makes it not okay. Like, it doesn't feel right. Now, many of us who, are sort of, again, observers and participants in the cultural shifts that are happening in America know that saying, well, it doesn't feel right, that maybe speak very honestly to your experience, but that's not a good enough reason to tell someone you can't progress to the places that other people have progressed to, right? And it's just been really interesting to see the way that the people who are, let's say, in power for this sake, right? The people running these organizations, the people who congregants have turned to and said, like, we don't like the way this is going, you do something about it. They can't say, here's a specific issue. And in fact, they agree there's no halachic issue, right? There's no actual Jewish religious problem for any particular thing that we're doing. But it's something about it when we have a title and we're clergy and we're functioning the same capacity as a male rabbi that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And that's where I came in and said, guys, then if you're seeing what I do as a threat to the Orthodox identity, that means that the Orthodox identity is not very strong right now, because it's so easy for a movement to define itself as like, yeah, and I think many of us, myself included, how would I describe Orthodoxy to someone who's never met an Orthodox Jew before? I'd say, like the people with the black hats and the black coats. Okay, they're Orthodox, but we are too. And it means that, like, men and women have different levels of participation. No. It's one of the first things that comes up. How do you know you're in an Orthodox shul? You walk in and there's a mechitza, right? And the the Amud where people lead davening from is only on the men's side. So yes, I understand why people feel threatened then by Maharat. When I say Maharat, I mean the program, because it's still called Maharat. And when that's challenging the norms. But if the norms are really just a placeholder for an identity, well, that's not good enough. Then we need to come up with a better identity of who we are. And I do think that Orthodoxy is struggling with that right now, and struggling to figure that out. And, it's fun. I mean, it's funny to be speaking about these issues because I feel like, especially, since COVID and so many other things erupted, it's just like, who even cares? This feels like a million, feels like a million years ago that our biggest problem was like the Orthodox Union, but I think it's an important, behavioral trend to observe beyond just Orthodoxy, and in many areas, in many ways, when something doesn't feel right, well, maybe it means we just have to do a better job of defining who we are. Yes, I saw a hand. Yes.
Rabbi Leslie Weiner.
Hi.
It's a pleasure studying with you this evening. We have 4 children, and it's the youngest son, who's a twin, who became very Orthodox. We're very conservative. And I'm curious if you've ever been approached, well, as a woman, you couldn't be a rabbi because rabbis are men, and we have time-sensitive mitzvot that you need to be able to participate in. And because you're a woman, you couldn't do that. Has anyone ever approached that with you?
Oh, I have that conversation with myself in my head constantly. So I don't need even anyone else to tell me. So first I'll backtrack and say my husband, Yoni, is from Englewood, New Jersey, which is right next door to Teaneck. And, went to the Orthodox day schools, has 2 brothers, went to Minyan with his father every Sunday morning, of course, every Shabbos. He was the kid in college who was like bothering the other kids. Can you please get up at 7 a.m. so we can have a Minyan? That guy, right? The most like standard modern Orthodox example of like what these movements want for themselves. And so people would say, well, you're not going to go to Minyan if it means Yoni can't go, like when you have kids, right? Like, of course you can't take his place at Minyan. And I'll say like, well, let's see what happens. And the truth is, if one of us makes it, it more likely is me. Certainly on Shabbos, it's my job to be there, right? But I think that that's something that's been a huge struggle for those of us graduates of Maharat who do work in shuls, because I have definitely been in situations where there is me and 9 men and we don't have a minyan and we're waiting for the 10th man. Now, if I like took offense to that in a very deep way every time it happened, I can't then have my job, right? That that just wouldn't work, right? And so I mean, it's fine. I handle it. You live with it. But I definitely know the feeling of it, and it's some of my colleagues, we've discussed that feeling when you're walking in, and the 8 men or the 9 men look up with excitement to see, oh, the 10th man is here, right? And then they realize it's you, and it's like, oh, hey, Marat, I was like, shoot, we still don't have a minyan. So yes, it's hard. And there are the ways that it makes it like at times a little bit uncomfortable. I will say that on the rare occasion Rabbi Hertzfeld goes out of town and I'm running minyan, it still like gives me anxiety because it just feels like such a male space. And oftentimes I'll just say to Yoni, like, you go instead, you deal with it and you'll count anyway and that's fine. And in the few weeks over the summer when it's really like a lot of people are out of town, there's definitely been more than one situation where I literally called Yoni and said, like, go out, put your shoes on, go outside. I drive up. I don't even close the car door. I jump out of the house, jump out of the car and run into the house, and he jumps into the car because we needed a 10th. We didn't have a 10th, and someone's got to be home with the kids. And so I've gone and switched with him. Now that I just consider to be like, if I'm working in Orthodoxy, do I hope that changes? Would I love for Orthodoxy to become egalitarian? Yes, 1,000%. But for now, that's what I signed up for. That's the way this stuff works. And I can't let it, penetrate my soul, or else I won't be able to survive. One way I've dealt with it, though, is really by, I think modern Orthodoxy, and I don't fault it for this, but I think there's this very confusing identity crisis in a way, because it knows that there's a difference between what men and women do, but at the same time, a lot of it is, well, let's teach women Gemara, let's involve women in Jewish life more, right? And so it's like, oh, it's great for women to come to Minyan, but then you still don't count. And I've instead, my approach for now, while I have 2 little kids at home, has been more to just own that reality that like, I don't count in the Minyan. I've got little kids. It's just really hard. I mean, right now, what is Mincha, 4:35? Yeah, I mean, like it's just really hard to get out of the house, especially during COVID. And so instead of feeling like I somehow have to beat myself up, be the mom, and then get to Minyan when, as you're saying, like I don't even count in the Minyan, instead I choose to say, you know what? There's a reason this halacha was developed the way it is. Once you have a family, just for my family at least, I don't know, maybe my kids aren't usually demanding. I have two little boys who are very energetic, but it would be very difficult for both me and my husband to feel that we both had to be places. And so it's just really hard. But like I said, I own it. And frankly, I rarely make it during the week. Maybe one mincha a week I try to go, but it's just not something I can prioritize, because if I do, and I spent years being so stressed out about not being there, and it was just so anxiety consuming. And finally I said, Ruth, like, you can't live with this, and realize that my feminism right now, my feminism within Orthodoxy and within my job is saying, if I don't count, not my problem, right? I don't mean so callously, but like, you guys deal with this is your territory. I'll be at home with my kids or whatever it is that I'm dealing with.
I have two questions.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to ask my quick questions, and then it looks like Rona and Carol both have questions. So I really appreciate everything you just said. One question is, do you think over time modern Orthodoxy will evolve to egalitarianism? I once had a conversation with my sister-in-law in Israel, who's Orthodox, and we're talking about, how like, for when all my friends were getting married, when we were all getting married, we all lived in Jerusalem, and we were all getting married, and everybody was doing like these, like Ufra, like the women were doing, and we were reading Torah, not me, because I tried to learn once and I was like, it's not for me. But not to say that I won't. My children have tried to teach me. But anyway, it was very separate but progressive. And I remember having a conversation when we moved back to America with my sister-in-law who lives in Israel, and saying like, wait a minute, and Renon's this conservative rabbi, and like we bent over backwards to make sure that we could have these, women's Torah readings, yet like sitting here in this conservative setting, like I can't figure out, like, why wouldn't my daughter just get up on the bima and read Torah for the kahal? And my sister-in-law, bless her, looked at me and she said, Orthodoxy just moves slowly. We're not there yet. And her point wasn't like, her point was like, there's nothing wrong with your daughter. And by the way, I don't think I had any children at the time, but she said, there's nothing wrong with your daughter getting up on the bima and reading Torah for the kahal. She's like, and this was 22 years ago. She said, the last 15 years, which was 15 years prior to 22 years ago, she's like, the last 15 years, the things that have changed within modern Orthodoxy are amazing. And what's going to change is amazing. So that was my one long way of saying, like, do you think that that will come? And the second thing, it kind of begs the question of like, at any point, did you consider a conservative rabbinical school?
Yeah. I so appreciate that comment that Shira, your sister, made, right? Yeah, because that's what I always tell people. Orthodoxy changes. It just takes 20 years longer than anywhere else. And it feels so passe, right? Because it's like, oh, I mean, can you imagine 2013 saying, I'm part of this group that just ordained women rabbis? I mean, how backwards does that sound, right? It's like, hello, American society and like other movements dealt with this 20, 30 years ago, and now in 2013, we're getting around to it. It's like, I'm self-conscious about that. Yes, I absolutely think Orthodoxy is moving in an egalitarian direction. What I mean by that is, I think that there are slowly more people who are younger, which I'll define in a second, who are, I don't know if they even care that much to call themselves Orthodox, but certainly would live a lifestyle that would look Orthodox in terms of level of halachic observance and involvement, et cetera, who are egalitarian. My sister is 10 years younger than me, Leora, and she got married a couple years ago. I mean, she's 25, and she lives in Jerusalem with her husband. And, she went to Barnard also, which when I was there is just so many modern Orthodox students, right? And my sense is just that she and her friends all graduated college and all moved to Israel together. And I think that there's just sort of a vacuum. There's no good or very little open Orthodox leadership in America right now. that really knows how to handle this. I don't think there's a niche, but certainly in Israel, egalitarianism is more prevalent than it is in the United States. And also, I remember talking with her, and I was like, okay, so who davens where at Barnard Columbia Hillel? You know, the biggest Hillel, or at least the biggest Orthodox population in a secular college in the United States, right? Who's going to Minyan there? And where are they going? And she was like, well, if you're like right wing Orthodox, you know, you go to the Orthodox Minyan. But if you're more progressive socially, you know, but halakhically observant, you don't go there because you don't hate women. Now, she didn't literally mean she thinks Orthodox people or anyone who davens non-egalitarian hates women, but she was like being descriptive in that response, right? By saying like, that's the thinking right now. So yes, I absolutely think that there already is some egalitarianism. I think it's going to grow, but I think that's also going to happen at the same time that fewer people are just going to care about whether they have the name Orthodox or not. And frankly, I heard, you know, Maharat was they were very insistent, especially at the beginning, like you have to identify as Orthodox if you want to come here, you know, and that they were having a harder time finding students who, you know, my sister's age, who cared enough to say like, yes, I'm absolutely Orthodox. It's just, I think you know, all the Jewish professional organizations talk about denominations are, you know, going by the wayside. And I think I don't know if that's true big Gadol, but certainly here, I think like the labels are less important. And at the same time, yes, like your question of, you know, couldn't I just have gone to, you know, JTS and become a conservative rabbi? Yes, people definitely asked me that before. And my answer is with total like respect for other movements and, you know, humility. I just feel like Orthodoxy is my home, in a, you know, for better or worse, sometimes worse. Yeah, and it felt like it's the movement that I identify with most. But I also know that I am not the end of the story. I'm just I am a step in the story, and that I don't think it's my place to, you know, come out and introduce Orthodox egalitarianism. You know, that's someone else's job. So I know that, you know, I'm not the end game.
Thank you. Okay, so Carol had a question and Rona had a question. So Carol, why don't you go first?
Right, I do have a question. First, I want to tell you a small world connection. My father-in-law of blessed memory studied with Rabbi Herzfeld for many, many years. So please tell him that you met me. I'm Carol Goldberg, and my father-in-law was Frank Dye. And Frank was an amazing man. And so I'm certain he will remember Frank. And once I actually went with Frank to Rabbi Herzfeld's office and we studied together.
Wow.
Long time ago, can't remember when it was, but anyway, so please tell him that I say hello.
Absolutely.
And then my question was, I think you said, Vicki, or you said this at the beginning, I just can't remember. What are your duties and how are they different than Rabbi Herzfeld's duties?
Great. Yes. Okay. So our responsibilities, 85% of them are personality based. I am a details person. You've met Rabbi Herzfeld. He is not. You don't want him in charge of anything that involves knowing where the paper cups are. I mean, not that we have an executive director do the planning stuff, but I do the details. So a lot of it is personality. I would say the things that are more like only really gender specific are, we have a mikvah, so that's, you know, my territory. And he does minyan. And we have by far the most gender segregated clergy model for minyan than any of my friends, my Maharat friends and the male rabbis that they work with. Rabbi Herzfeld, lucky for me, loves minyan and never misses a minyan if he's in town, only if he's out of town. Right. And so when I just sort of really had to pull back from minyan for a variety of reasons, like family life and all that stuff, it wasn't like I was saying to him, sorry, you have to come 7 days a week now. He was there already. And I'm very lucky in that respect because most my other friends don't have that same luxury. Other than that, it's really a mix. You know, I mean, at this point, to compare it to like another synagogue, I'm like the associate rabbi. And so, you know, when I came, I was the assistant, and I'm the associate now. And so, yeah, so we work together. We have our own little spheres as well. Yeah.
Okay, and Rona, did you have a question still?
Actually, part of that she answered, but now I have another. By the way, when I was in Israel on my tour in November, my tour guide sent me on Friday night for Kabbalah to Shir Hadash, which was mostly immigrants, from what I could see. They were not like native Israelis unless they didn't seem to be. And I didn't know where I was going, okay? Because I had actually meant to go to the Reconstructionist congregation, but forgotten the name. And so I got there and, then I realized there was a mechitza. So I went with the women's side. They made me feel very, very welcome. They sang the same melodies we did, everything else. But the woman conducted Kabbalah. But then when it came time for the rest, the man took over. The male took over. And she introduced herself actually out in the hall and said, well, come on in. And I'm doing this. So my question for you was, what parts of services do you do, or is that part of your function?
Yeah, so they're what's called a partnership minyan. I don't know if that term is like super familiar. It's kind of like the same idea of Maharat, which is there are certain red halachic lines that we can't cross, but we want to maximize women's involvement and leadership until those red lines, right? So for Maharat, that means I don't lead davening, I don't count in the minyan, but yeah, I give sermons. Yeah, I'm like part of the leadership. Yeah, I do all these things, right? Because like, why not? There's no reason why not to. For partnership minyan is basically the same idea for prayer service, which is women should not lead, Shachrit, Mincha, or Mariv. But why not Kabbalat Shabbat? It's just singing, right? Why can't they read Torah? It's not a formal prayer service. Why can't they get an aliyah? And so, yeah, so our synagogue is actually not partnership. There is a group of my congregants formed a partnership minyan, which like an informal partnership minyan, which meets occasionally. Really essentially just to like give the bat mitzvah girls, who learn all this laning for the bat mitzvah, more of an opportunity to lane, which is a huge problem within Orthodoxy that we have not figured out at all. But yeah, so that's actually not services that we ourselves have, which is kind of funny. Everyone's got their own red line.
Okay, so now if I haven't forgotten what that hit me a second ago. By the way, I grew up after we moved to Texas from New York at I used to call it Texadox because they were compromises because we came in 61, okay? And they needed to keep membership. So I did a Friday night Kabbalah bat mitzvah, but my sister, like 5 years later, did something, she read something out of the Torah because I have her chumash that she studied with, and it's marked in the front page where she read. So I'm not sure what the compromise was, and when they built the new sanctuary, and this is Tiferet Israel, and I'm sure they didn't have a mechitza, okay? But when they built the new sanctuary, they had 3 sections of seats, or 4, okay? The middle was mixed. One side was men and one side was women. And that was how they kept their membership in the 60s happy.
The trifecta.
It was like, but like for the high holidays, the choir was all male. There was no there was no instruments. Going to Temple Youth was a shock to go to services there. I felt like I was in church at the big temple, but it was just, and they had the 2 kitchens and they had the mikveh, and they were the only Orthodox congregation at that point in Dallas in 1961. Yeah. But it was a different.
Rona, I'm going to have to cut you off.
That's okay, but I forgot what else I was going to ask, so that's okay.
Okay, think about it, jot it in the chat. We have about 10 minutes left. So Ruth, I'm going to put it on you. Do you want to take a few more questions, or do you want to do a little teaching? However you want to finish.
Well, do we have more questions?
So Ruth prepared a little Hanukkah teaching for us. So if we want to transition to that before I think let's do that if it's okay.
Sure, we can do that. I just want to say hi, Bernice is here. Hi. I guess, yeah, if everyone knows Bernice's daughter we are close neighbors, and they're our closest, dearest friends here. And so, hello. I know. I was like, yeah, I didn't even make the connection.
Great to see you. And I tell everybody how wonderful your congregation is and how wonderful you are in the congregation. So, but I rather they hear it from you directly.
My goodness, Bernice's grand dog is my buddy. She's
right.
I really like dogs. It's kind of freakish. Okay. Anyway, so I am going to, what I'll just do now is screen share. Now we could easily spend 45 minutes on this text. And it's a text I've seen used more this year for Hanukkah than ever before. And so for all I know, you have studied it already, but I still wanted to provide a different take on it. And so when we talk about Hanukkah, of course, we talk about the story that we know, right? What's the story we teach our kids? Maccabees, Greeks, temple, miracle, the light, etc. But like I said, a source I've seen played out this year much more than ever before, which is a source I had known but really didn't appreciate until I studied it this year, especially with the bat mitzvah girl whose bat mitzvah was this morning on Zoom. And it was very, very beautiful, even though I know it wasn't exactly what she had in mind originally. And so I just wanted to go to just review it quickly, and we'll just do a very fast look at it, and something that could take a lot more time. So this is from the tractate in the Gemara of the Talmud, the tractate of Avodah Zarah, which means idol worship, which talks about that. And so the Mishnah states that these are the festivals of the idolaters, the New Year and the Saturnalia, or the calendar and the Saturnalia. You can look at their Wikipedia page if you want. They're basically Roman pagan holidays around the winter equinox and the New Year, etc. And then Rav Chanan in the Gemara, Rav Chanan bar Rabba says that calendar takes place 8 days after the solstice, and Saturnalia 8 days prior to the solstice. Right, so the solstice meaning the shortest daylight of the year, that calendar is beforehand, and Saturnalia, after, and Saturnalia is before it, which itself seems like, okay, fine, that's just a statement of fact. But actually then they introduce a story that I think makes me appreciate that fact in a way that I hadn't really before. So then they say, our rabbis taught, when Adam Harishon, right, when Adam, who traditionally we say was created on Rosh Hashanah, right, in the fall, when the days are going to be getting shorter, he saw the day getting gradually shorter, right? As he progressed through the fall and into the winter, he notices that every day the daylight is a little bit shorter than it was the previous day. And he said, woe is me, perhaps because I have sinned. The world around me is being darkened and returning to its state of tohu vavohu. This then is the kind of death to which I've been sentenced from heaven. Right, so he looks around and he says, oh no, this is my fault, right? We assume it's referring to the sin of eating, from the fruit and the tree back in the Garden of Eden. And therefore, he looks around and he says, the world's getting darker and returning to tohu vavohu, which, if you may remember, is the state that the primordial chaos, right? Before God creates light, the first day of light, what is the world? It's tohu vavohu. It's nothingness swirling around the world. And so he thinks creation is being undone slowly because of the sin that I committed. And he accepts, okay, this is the kind of death that I've been sentenced. This is my fate. And so what did he do? He began keeping an 8 days fast, right? Even though he says, this is my fate, maybe he still thinks this is our original form of tshuva, right? It shows actually maybe human action can change God's decree. So he begins to keep an 8 day fast. But as we know, he's going to reach the solstice when the daylight is as short as possible, and then the days are going to start to get longer again. And so that's exactly what happens. As he observed the winter equinox and noted the day getting increasingly longer, he said, oh, this is the world's course. Right? Oh, that's just the way the world goes. The world isn't ending, right? I'm not being punished. This is just nature. And he set forth to keep an 8 days festivity. So 8 days fast beforehand and 8 days festivity afterwards. And in the following year, he appointed both as festivals. Now he fixed them for the sake of heaven, but the heathens appointed them for the sake of idolatry, right? So they have to get that statement in there because after all, they're talking about how awful idolaters are. So what we see here is that the winter equinox for Adam Harishon, for Adam, represented this tremendous fear and anxiety. And so and then as a result of realizing that actually the world was not ending, he created 2 festivities, right? One before and one after. Now, I just wanted to point out that I think it's very interesting to say that he appointed one before and one after. Now, of course, what we then understand is that Hanukkah, and there are other different versions of the same midrash that say this more explicitly, that Hanukkah is the Jewish version, right? Everyone, all these nations of the world have different winter light holidays, and it happens to be the Hanukkah's ours. And of course, they're going to say it's for the godly purposes, right? And as we know, Hanukkah celebrates light and darkness, and it's certainly a joyous holiday. And so we think of it as something as celebrating light and darkness. But what I also just wanted to point out here is that not only is this Gemara alleging that the idea of a winter light festival is not just a Jewish idea, it's a universal idea. It's also giving as much importance and weight to a festival that celebrates the fear as much as the celebration. Because the fear is what's leading into it, right? If you're going to celebrate the 8 days before the winter equinox, what you're saying is our holiday corresponds to Adam's fear and anxiety building up towards the winter equinox, at which point he realizes, whew, the world is not ending, and then he celebrates. So why shouldn't we all shouldn't everyone's holiday be after the winter equinox, right? Shouldn't it all be celebration? What does it mean to have a holiday that's before? You're just marking the fear and anxiety. But no, other religions, you say what we're alleging here, they also have this as a time of celebration, or this is when they observe their holiday as well. And in fact, that very idea appears in a classic rabbinic debate, right, between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. Do I light 8 candles on the first night, and then 7 on the second night, and then 6 on the third night, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, decreasing the light every night? That's what Beit Shammai wants you to do. Because he says you're marking how many nights are left of Hanukkah. But of course, Beit Hillel says, no, you start on night 1 with 1, night 2 with 2 candles, the way that we all do it, right? We side with Beit Hillel. And we end up concluding we side with Beit Hillel because you're supposed to build up in holiness, right? You're supposed to build up in joy. What does it mean to start with 8 and then go down to 7? How are you supposed to find Hanukkah to be happier, be a happy holiday when you're starting it immediately with thinking about, oh, the best has already happened and you're decreasing the light? And so we've always in the past, when I learned Beit Shammai's position, we just sort of think, yeah, of course, who wants to start with the best and just focus on it getting less and less and less. But I think the year we're living in now, I really have a renewed appreciation for what the rabbis are saying here, which is that it is as valid to celebrate the joy and the relief of the celebration of Hanukkah as it is also to spend time in the fear and anxiety of Adam's uncertainty and the unknown of what became before him, and him worrying that maybe the world was ending. And especially this year, I think this is a year of fear and anxiety and uncertainty. And I really appreciate that this Gemara is willing to say that humanity leaned in not only to the joy, the relief afterwards, which God willing, we will all know in this coming year, but also that fear and anxiety has its own, and just the scariness and the depression has its own place also, and is itself a valid religious experience and spiritual presence to be in, especially tonight. We're halfway there, right? We could be Beit Hillel or Beit Shammai, but and so in a year where I think it's important to create space for us to also lean into those feelings, and not feel like those are feelings we need to set aside and only focus on joy. No, that the fear and anxiety also have a very important place in a religious tradition, even to the point where one religion may choose to mark that more than the actual joy and celebration as well. And yes, should we take one more question? Vicki, I turn it over to you.
Yes.
Sure, yeah, we can.
Rabbi, I studied once that before Hanukkah was an official holiday, that when the Maccabees came to the temple to clean it up, they were in fact belatedly celebrating Sukkot for 8 days. So how does this approach impact the darkness and the light, the joyousness of Sukkot? And then of course we had the holiness of the Ner Tamid. We only had one, enough for 1 day, but we had, for 8 days. Any juxtaposition of that?
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that specific explanation. But Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, if you want to Google it, has a great lengthy piece, but it's worth it. I think it's on the OU website about his own historical analysis of what Hanukkah represented. I didn't know that one specifically, but I think Hanukkah has multiple valences. I just think it's and this Gemara isn't really like, it doesn't become a focal point of why we celebrate Hanukkah, right? And it's not about Hanukkah. It's about establishing this idea of an 8-day holiday, right? And it happened to become Hanukkah. So I don't know, maybe there you could find something there, right? It's important. This is not saying this is what Hanukkah is. It's saying that recognizing, and I think it's true, right? Of course, like, what did Jewish kids growing up in the United States know? Like, oh, Hanukkah, it's like our Christmas, right? Like, a lot of these holidays, a lot of these religions have these holidays where they just throw up a bunch of lights everywhere in the middle of the winter, and that there's something universally human about that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. We are just a minute or so over, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I will tell you, Maharat Ruth Friedman, that if we lived in the same city, you would be my second rabbi. I'm just putting it out there. I'm married to the other one, so.
I was going to ask you, talking about your husband. Yeah.
But yeah, so I cannot thank you enough for giving us the time that you did. It was a sheer pleasure, really, like, just so lovely and so interesting to explore these topics with you, because even what you were saying, you didn't use the phrase, but Renan often talks about a post-denominational world, right? And he's very much involved in that, and we think of Orthodox, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, et cetera, renewal, et cetera. But the fact is that, like, in speaking with you, it's a little mushier than that. It's a little more fluid in a really optimistic way, a really, really progressive, optimistic way. So we thank you, and I thank everybody for coming, and I wish everybody a Hanukkah Sameach. You are all welcome to say goodbye if you want to. Nava, you can unmute everybody if anybody wants to say a quick hello. We have like another 3 minutes before we'll shut it all down. Okay, so thank you, Ruth, really.
Thank you.
Very much.
Can I ask you, I know that some of the congregations, like the Riverdale, they have women's minions too, separately.
Women's tefillah. Yeah, we have women's tefillah meet occasionally. Yeah.
I just wondered, because
Yeah. Me too.
Good Yom Tov to everyone. Chag
Yeah.
Sameach.
yes.
Enjoy the candlelight.
It was a pleasure.
Stay dry.
Oh, I
Thank you.
see you, Maharat Ruth. I feel so at home with you being here.
Are you coming back anytime soon?
Oh, once I can start flying again,
Yeah.
my sons-in-law drove me last time, so I don't want to ask them to do that again. But I certainly cavil thinking back on their doing it in the past.
Yeah. Well, Addie's new gnome hat is incredibly adorable. So I don't know if you've seen it, but it's very cute.
Yes.
Yeah.
They got me a digital frame for Hanukkah, so I see him in front of me all the time. But I'm glad to hear from you in person. That's really cute.
Yeah.
Debbie, when I was there in July, Debbie wanted to order it, and she, it's like, what? But it's really cute.
Debbie puts us all to shame. So organized. She's one of those.
Well, you are too.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you for sharing your time and the information. It was really
It was lovely, really. I try to take advantage of the silver linings of this whole situation right now with COVID, and I meet people all over.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah.
Well, here, when you're done with the talk, you're already home. You don't have to get on a plane and fly somewhere.
Well, that's one thing I've learned about myself in COVID is I have social anxiety, but it doesn't translate to Zoom. Like it's such a, I don't know, it just takes so much of the pressure off when you're just still in your own house,
Right.
And like
Yeah.
I was telling you that, like, Renan has found that there's this intimacy in Zoom that you wouldn't expect, given that when you're on Zoom, you're not physically close. You're often thousands and thousands of miles away from the next person. But like, I was telling you, like, at Shiva Minyanim, it has been, I mean, so moving when so-and-so's it was, for those of you who knew her, may she rest in peace, Lila Lerner's granddaughter was in New York. And she's looking at this sea of faces, and she looks up, she starts to talk about her grandmother, and she looks up and she's like, was almost surprised. And she starts telling a story and she starts to cry. And then like 40 faces start to cry with her, right? even though
Mhm.
nobody's sitting next to her except for her friend. It was
I know.
so intimate and so close in this, what I would consider very counterintuitive, but like when you talk about leaning in, Ruth, like Ramon is just like totally leaned into that,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and been very, very
Yeah.
meaningful for
It's
him.
interesting because my observation was also around death. It was around a funeral specifically, actually, of someone who tragically died of COVID way before his time. But it was to see everyone in their homes and not in their like suits, and it felt so much more raw, like almost like in Israel, where you go in whatever you're wearing, and there it is that weird like intimacy. I like that word, intimacy.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it felt very powerful.
I like that in those situations, which I
Mhm.
have been to a couple of like funerals or the minions, that I would never have been able to be at.
Right. Right.
One in New York, well, one funeral was in New York, but then even the husband couldn't be there. So and the minions were in Chicago area.
Right.
So it was just wonderful to be able to be there. The other was my cousin, the same thing,
Mhm.
in New York. And it was wonderful to be able to share that,
Yeah.
where otherwise, actually I've been
Right.
to three like that. Yeah. So
You would not have gone. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we're gonna say goodbye to everybody. Thank you
Thank
again.
you.
Bye.
It was
Chag
such a
Sameach,
pleasure.
everyone.
Chag Sameach.
Take care.
Have a great night.